Dewey Day La Fan Story Intro Theo Dung Ka Truck Vayu Ka Kwaban. Edit Single Dad was having tea alone, until CEO's Quadruplet girls whispered, "Pretend you're our father." Why would four young girls make such an unexpected request? And what could possibly happen after a single whispered sentence like that? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with kindness, hope, and unforgettable moments, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Your support means the world to us, and we're truly grateful that you've chosen to spend your time with our community today. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, if you heard those exact words, what would your first reaction be? Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let's step into the beginning of this remarkable story. Sometimes the family we need finds us before we even know we're lonely. Nathan Walker never imagined that an ordinary cup of Earl Grey would become the beginning of a story no one at the table could have predicted. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of the Whitmore Tea House, painting warm golden patterns across polished oak floors, while soft piano music drifted through the room like an old memory. The scent of fresh scones, cinnamon, and imported tea leaves lingered gently in the air, wrapping every conversation in quiet comfort. Nathan sat alone near the window, stirring his tea without really looking at it. At 40 years old, he had grown accustomed to silence. After years of raising his daughter on his own and learning that peace often arrived disguised as routine, he found comfort in small rituals that asked nothing from him. Every Saturday at exactly 3 o'clock, he came to the same corner table, ordered the same tea, opened the same weathered novel, and watched strangers pass by outside without wondering where they were headed. There was dignity in ordinary moments, he often believed. Not every miracle needed to arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it entered quietly, wearing the sound of tiny footsteps. The brass bell above the entrance chimed softly as several sharply dressed security professionals stepped inside first, scanning the room with practiced calm before moving aside. Conversations faded for only a second before returning to their gentle rhythm, but Nathan barely noticed. He turned another page, lifted his teacup, and listened to the peaceful clink of porcelain against its saucer. Then he heard whispers, not loud enough for anyone else to notice. Just four tiny voices, perfectly synchronized, carrying more determination than fear. "Excuse me, mister?" Nathan lowered his cup. Standing beside his table were four identical little girls, each with bright blue eyes, neatly braided blonde hair, and matching pale yellow dresses that somehow made them look like reflections in four separate mirrors. They couldn't have been older than 6. They exchanged nervous glances before the smallest one stepped closer, her fingers twisting together as if gathering courage from the others. Nathan offered the kind smile that had always come naturally whenever children looked uncertain. "Hi there," he said gently. "Are you girls looking for your parents?" The four sisters looked at each other again. Their expressions carried a sadness far older than childhood should ever know, yet there was still hope quietly shining behind their eyes. Finally, the tallest girl leaned closer until only Nathan could hear her trembling voice. "Please," she whispered, "pretend you're our father." Time seemed to pause. Even the steam rising from Nathan's untouched teacup felt frozen between one heartbeat and the next. He blinked, certain he had misunderstood. "I'm sorry," he asked softly, careful not to alarm them. The little girl swallowed hard and repeated the exact same words, slower this time, as though every syllable carried the weight of a wish she'd been holding inside for far too long. "Please, pretend you're our father." Nathan looked from one child to the next, searching for confusion, mischief, or the beginning of a harmless game. Instead, he found four pairs of hopeful eyes silently waiting for an answer that neither they nor he fully understood. Nathan felt his heartbeat slow instead of race. Children rarely asked for impossible things unless, in their own small way, they believed impossible things could still come true. He carefully set his teacup onto its saucer, making sure the soft click of porcelain did not startle them. "That is a very big favor," he said with a gentle smile. "Can you tell me why?" Before any of the girls could answer, they all glanced toward the grand entrance of the tea house. It was not fear that crossed their faces. It was urgency. The smallest sister reached for Nathan's hand with tiny trembling fingers. "Just for a little while," she whispered. "Please." Nathan looked down at her hand resting against his sleeve. He had spent years learning that children often revealed the truth long before adults found the right words. Whatever had brought these four sisters to his table, they were not playing a game. They were searching for comfort. A slow murmur drifted across the elegant room as more security personnel appeared near the entrance, speaking quietly into small earpieces while guests pretended not to stare. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Silverware still touched fine china. Waiters still served fresh pastries, and soft piano notes still floated through the room, yet everyone could sense that someone important had arrived. Nathan finally noticed the subtle shift around him. He looked toward the entrance for only a moment before returning his attention to the children. Their worried expressions mattered far more than anyone else's reputation. "All right," he said softly. "If this helps you feel safe for a minute, I can sit with you." Relief spread across four young faces all at once. It was remarkable how quickly hope could replace worry. The girls exchanged bright smiles before sliding into the empty chairs surrounding Nathan's table as naturally as though they had practiced the moment 100 times in their imaginations. One reached for a menu but never opened it. Another quietly adjusted the flowers in the center of the table. The third rested her chin in her hands while watching Nathan with innocent curiosity. The fourth simply smiled, a smile that seemed almost unfamiliar to her own face. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered so quietly that only Nathan heard it. He hesitated for the briefest moment, then answered with kindness instead of correction. "You are welcome." Across the room, every member of the security team suddenly became alert. Their attention shifted toward the staircase leading into the private dining lounge above the main floor. Elegant footsteps echoed gently against polished marble. The conversations around the tea house faded until only the piano remained. Guests instinctively turned their eyes toward the woman descending the staircase. Victoria Hayes carried herself with calm confidence that could not be purchased or rehearsed. Her tailored ivory suit reflected understated elegance rather than extravagance, and her composed expression revealed the discipline of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions every single day. Business magazines called her one of the most influential chief executive officers in America. Financial networks followed every investment she made. Yet in that moment, none of those accomplishments occupied her thoughts. Her eyes searched only for four little girls. They found them almost immediately, sitting around a quiet stranger, smiling in a way she had not seen in longer than she cared to remember. Victoria stopped halfway across the room. She did not speak. She simply watched as the smallest sister leaned gently against Nathan's arm while he poured warm tea into four tiny cups with patient, fatherly care, never asking for attention, never expecting recognition. And for the first time in many months, the powerful woman who could command boardrooms with a single sentence found herself unable to take another step. Victoria Hayes drew a slow breath before continuing toward the table. Every executive in the room recognized the calm expression she wore whenever billion-dollar negotiations demanded perfect composure. But today that familiar confidence felt strangely fragile. She stopped beside the children and looked first at Nathan, then at each of her daughters. None of them appeared frightened. In fact, they looked more peaceful than she had seen in months. "Girls," she said softly, "would someone like to explain what is happening?" The sisters exchanged nervous glances, until the oldest spoke. "We just wanted to have tea together." Victoria nodded patiently. "I can see that. But why is this gentleman sitting with you?" Silence settled over the table. Nathan gently placed his teacup down before speaking. "I believe your daughters were hoping I could help them for a few minutes. They have been perfectly polite." Victoria studied him carefully. His navy sweater was neatly pressed but clearly well worn. His hands carried the faint marks of honest work rather than luxury. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance except the calm dignity in the way he met her eyes without trying to impress her or avoid her gaze. She had spent years reading people across conference tables, and yet this man revealed almost nothing beyond quiet kindness. Before she could respond, the smallest girl reached for her mother's hand. "Please do not be upset with him, Mommy. It was our idea." The words landed more heavily than anyone expected. Victoria slowly lowered herself into the empty chair beside the table. "Your idea?" she asked gently. All four girls nodded together. Another sister whispered, "We saw him sitting alone. Every Saturday," added another. "He always smiles at everyone. He even thanked the waitress for bringing hot water," the third said. Nobody thanks people anymore. The youngest looked directly at her mother. He looks like someone who listens. Nathan felt slightly embarrassed by the unexpected compliments. You girls have wonderful imaginations, he said with a warm smile. I think you are giving me far too much credit. The oldest quickly shook her head. No, sir. We watched. Victoria blinked. Watched. For 3 Saturdays, the little girl answered honestly. We came here after my piano lessons. We always sat upstairs. We saw you reading, drinking tea, smiling at people, and feeding little birds outside before you came in. Nathan laughed quietly. I did not realize I had an audience. You looked lonely, another sister admitted, but not sad. The words lingered in the air like the final notes of the piano nearby. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment. She suddenly realized that while her daughters had noticed a stranger's quiet routine, she had not noticed how carefully they had been observing the world around them. The waitress arrived carrying a fresh pot of tea and hesitated uncertainly. Nathan stood immediately and pulled out Victoria's chair with simple courtesy before sitting again only after she was comfortable. It was an ordinary gesture, almost forgotten in modern life, yet completely natural for him. Victoria thanked him softly. He answered with an easy smile. Everyone deserves a peaceful cup of tea. There was no attempt to charm her, no awareness of her wealth, no hint that he recognized the woman whose photograph appeared regularly on financial magazine covers. To Nathan, she was simply a mother trying to understand her children. And somehow, that ordinary respect unsettled Victoria more than admiration ever could. The tea house gradually returned to its gentle rhythm, yet something invisible had changed around that small table by the window. The piano continued its quiet melody. Porcelain cups clinked softly against polished saucers, and afternoon sunlight painted warm ribbons across the hardwood floor. But Nathan noticed that the 4 little girls no longer looked over their shoulders every few seconds. Their shoulders had relaxed. Their laughter came more easily. Even the youngest sister reached confidently for another warm scone instead of waiting for permission. Victoria watched every tiny moment without interrupting. She had attended international conferences, negotiated mergers worth billions of dollars, and spoken before thousands of investors without hesitation. But she suddenly realized she could not remember the last time she had simply watched her daughters enjoy being children. Her calendar had always seemed more urgent than another afternoon together. Meetings became flights. Flights became interviews. Interviews became charity galas. Somewhere along the endless road of success, ordinary Saturdays had quietly disappeared. Nathan poured a little more tea into each tiny cup with the same patient care he might have shown his own family. Careful, he said with a warm smile. It is still a little hot. The oldest girl waited exactly as he suggested. The second copied him by gently blowing across the surface before taking a careful sip. The third proudly folded her napkin onto her lap because she noticed Nathan had done the same. The youngest looked up with bright eyes. Did your parents teach you good manners? Nathan smiled thoughtfully before answering. My mother believed kindness begins with little things. Holding a door, saying thank you, listening when someone else is speaking. Those habits stay with you much longer than fancy things ever do. The girls listened as though every word mattered. Victoria quietly lowered her eyes. She could purchase almost anything her daughters desired, yet she suddenly wondered whether she had forgotten to give them the things that could never be bought. Nathan noticed the thoughtful expression on her face and gently changed the subject before any discomfort could grow. You 4 must enjoy spending time together. The sisters laughed all at once. We do everything together, one answered proudly. We even finish each other's stories, another added. Sometimes sentences, said the third. The youngest giggled. Sometimes sandwiches. Nathan laughed with them, and the sound felt so natural that several nearby guests smiled without even realizing why. Victoria found herself smiling as well. It surprised her. Smiles had become increasingly rare outside carefully posed photographs. One of the girls suddenly looked toward Nathan with innocent curiosity. Do you come here because you are waiting for somebody? The question carried no judgment, only genuine wonder. Nathan looked through the window where autumn leaves drifted gently along the sidewalk. Not anymore, he answered honestly. Years ago, my wife and I used to visit little places like this whenever we could. After she passed away, I kept coming because it reminds me that beautiful memories do not disappear. They simply become quieter. The table fell silent. Even the youngest child understood enough to lower her eyes respectfully. Victoria felt an unexpected ache inside her heart. She had assumed loneliness always announced itself loudly. Yet the man sitting across from her carried it with such grace that it had become almost invisible. The oldest sister slowly reached across the table and placed her tiny hand over Nathan's. "I think she would be happy that you still smile," she whispered. Nathan looked at the little hand resting gently on his and blinked once before returning the smile. Across the table, Victoria realized that in less than 1 hour, a stranger had given her daughters something she had spent years trying to schedule, organize, and provide. He had simply given them his full attention, and somehow that ordinary gift had begun quietly healing every heart sitting around the table. Victoria remained unusually quiet after the conversation drifted into lighter topics. She answered when spoken to, smiled when her daughters laughed, yet her thoughts lingered on the gentle simplicity unfolding before her. For years she had believed that providing the very best schools, the safest homes, the finest opportunities, and every imaginable comfort was the greatest expression of love a mother could offer. Looking across the table, she began to wonder if presents had always mattered more than perfection. Nathan reached into the small paper bag resting beside his chair and pulled out a neatly wrapped package tied with plain blue string. One of the girls tilted her head curiously. "Is that a present?" she asked. Nathan chuckled softly. "Not exactly. Every Saturday, I bring homemade oatmeal cookies. I usually share them with the elderly couple who comes in around this time." He glanced toward the entrance before adding with a smile, "I baked a few extra this morning. Perhaps that turned out to be a good idea." The four sisters looked toward Victoria, waiting for permission before touching anything. She nodded gently. "You may each have one." Their excitement remained surprisingly polite. They thanked Nathan before taking a cookie, and after the first bite, for delighted smiles appeared almost at the same moment. "These are better than the bakery," one whispered. "They taste warm," another added. Nathan laughed. "That might be because they were made before sunrise." "You made them yourself?" Victoria asked, genuinely surprised. "Every weekend," he replied. "My daughter says food tastes different when somebody makes it thinking about the people who will eat it." Victoria paused. "You have a daughter?" "I do," Nathan answered, his smile growing softer. "Her name is Lily. She is 15 now, which means she reminds me almost every day that she is old enough to make her own decisions." The girls giggled together. "Does she still hug you?" the youngest asked. Nathan smiled toward the window before answering. "Not as often in public, but every night before bed, she still tells me to sleep well. I have learned that love changes its language as children grow." Victoria listened carefully. She had never heard anyone describe parenthood with such quiet gratitude. There was no complaint about sacrifice, no attempt to appear heroic, only peaceful acceptance of every season life offered. One of the sisters suddenly reached into her tiny handbag and carefully unfolded a crayon drawing. It showed a small house beneath a bright blue sky. Four smiling girls stood beside a woman in a business suit. On the opposite side stood an empty outline where another figure had clearly been imagined but never colored. Nathan studied the picture without speaking. "Who belongs here?" he finally asked. The oldest girl lowered her eyes. "We never knew." The room seemed to grow quieter. Even the soft piano melody faded into the background as Nathan considered the unfinished drawing. Instead of offering sympathy, he reached for the small box of colored pencils resting near the tea house children's activity basket. He selected a green pencil and gently placed it beside the empty outline. "Sometimes," he said kindly, "it is perfectly all right to leave part of a picture unfinished. Life has a beautiful way of surprising us when we least expect it." None of the girls colored the empty figure. Instead, they smiled at one another as though the unfinished space itself had become a promise rather than a loss. Victoria felt her eyes grow warm. She had spent years trying to fill every gap in her daughters' lives with expensive solutions. Yet this quiet stranger had offered them something infinitely more valuable. He had given them permission to hope without making a single promise. And somehow that simple act carried more comfort than any answer money had ever been able to buy. As the afternoon light slowly shifted across the windows, Nathan glanced at the simple watch on his wrist and realized more time had passed than he had intended. He smiled apologetically. "I should probably be heading home soon. My daughter will be expecting me before dinner." for small faces immediately lost a little of their brightness. None of the girls protested, yet the quiet disappointment in their eyes spoke more honestly than words ever could. Nathan noticed it immediately. "Do not look so serious," he said gently. "Every good afternoon deserves a happy ending." The youngest tilted her head. "How do you know when it is a happy ending?" Nathan thought for a moment before answering. "Because people leave carrying something better than what they brought with them." The little girl looked down at the unfinished drawing still resting beside her teacup. "I think we did." Victoria quietly watched the exchange while pretending to stir the tea she had long since stopped drinking. Something inside her was changing in ways she could neither explain nor ignore. She had built an entire career by measuring results, predicting outcomes, and solving problems before anyone else noticed them. Yet no business strategy had ever prepared her for the peaceful influence one ordinary man could have within a single afternoon. She looked toward one of her senior security officers standing discreetly near the entrance. Without drawing attention, she gave the slightest nod. A few moments later, the officer quietly stepped outside with his phone. Nathan remained completely unaware. The conversation drifted toward books, favorite desserts, autumn weather, and childhood memories. There was nothing extraordinary about the subjects themselves. The extraordinary part was how carefully Nathan listened before answering each question. He never interrupted. He never hurried the girls. He made each child feel as though her words deserved the entire room's attention. Victoria suddenly realized that genuine attention might be the rarest gift of all. Nearly 20 minutes later, the security officer returned and approached Victoria with professional discretion. He leaned down just enough for only her to hear. "Everything has been verified." She looked at him without speaking. "Nathan Walker, 40 years old, widower, mechanical engineer for the city transportation department. Excellent employment record. No legal issues. Volunteers twice a month at the public library reading program. Lives in a modest neighborhood in Brooklyn with his 15-year-old daughter, Lily. No debts beyond a standard home mortgage." Several neighbors described him as dependable, respectful, and the first person to help whenever someone needs it. Victoria listened quietly. "Anything else?" The officer hesitated before answering. "One neighbor said something unusual." "Go on." "She said that whenever someone thanks Mr. Walker for helping, he always gives the same answer." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "What answer?" The officer smiled faintly. "He says, 'Someday someone will need kindness from my daughter. I am simply sending a little ahead of her.'" Victoria remained completely still. The words settled deep inside her heart with a weight no financial report had ever carried. She slowly turned back toward Nathan. At that exact moment, one of the girls accidentally dropped her napkin onto the floor. Before anyone else could react, Nathan bent down, picked it up, and replaced it with a fresh one from the nearby service station instead of handing back the one that had touched the floor. It was such a small gesture that almost no one noticed. Victoria did. There was no audience worth impressing. No camera recording the moment. No reward waiting afterward. He simply chose thoughtfulness because that was who he was when nobody was watching. For perhaps the first time in many years, the woman who had spent her life judging success by achievements found herself quietly wondering whether true greatness had been sitting across the table all afternoon, pouring tea, sharing homemade cookies, and changing 5 lives without ever realizing he had changed even one. The clock above the tea house fireplace chimed softly, announcing the arrival of another peaceful hour. And Nathan slowly rose from his chair with the quiet reluctance of someone who had unexpectedly found joy in an ordinary afternoon. He reached for his worn leather satchel and smiled warmly at the 4 sisters. "I really should be going now," he said gently. "Someone very important is waiting for me at home." The youngest girl's smile faded almost instantly. "Your daughter?" she asked. Nathan nodded. "She has a habit of pretending she does not worry about me. But if I arrive late without calling, she suddenly remembers that fathers should answer their phones." The girls laughed softly, but their laughter quickly melted into silence. The oldest sister looked down at the unfinished drawing still resting beside her plate. "Can we tell you something?" Nathan sat back down without hesitation. "Of course." She took a slow breath. "We never planned to ask just anybody." Victoria remained perfectly still, sensing something her daughters had been carrying for much longer than a single afternoon. The second sister quietly continued. "We watched lots of people come here." "Businessmen," said the third. "Families," added the youngest. People who looked important. The oldest slowly shook her head. But they always looked busy. Nathan listened without interrupting. Then we saw you. You smiled at everybody, one whispered. Even when nobody smiled back. You always thanked the servers, another added. You waited until older people walked through the door before you went inside, said the third. The youngest looked directly into Nathan's eyes. You looked like someone who would never make children feel invisible. The words settled over the table with quiet honesty. Nathan lowered his eyes for a moment, humbled by the trust these little girls had placed in him. That is a very kind thing to say, he answered softly. But I am just an ordinary father trying to do ordinary things well. The oldest girl shook her head again. That is exactly why we chose you. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. She realized her daughters had not been searching for wealth, fame, or power. They had been searching for safety. Nathan folded his hands together before speaking again. May I tell all four of you something my wife once taught me? They nodded eagerly. She believed that family is not measured by how impressive someone looks or how successful they become. Family is measured by who makes you feel safe enough to be yourself. The sisters quietly absorbed every word. Even Victoria found herself holding her breath. Nathan continued with a gentle smile. You already have someone who loves you very deeply. He looked toward Victoria. Sometimes love becomes buried underneath responsibilities, meetings, and long days. But buried is not the same as gone. Victoria felt tears gathering despite every effort to remain composed. She had spent years convincing herself that sacrificing time today would create a better tomorrow for her daughters. Suddenly, she wondered how many tomorrows had quietly become yesterday. The youngest sister reached across the table and hugged Nathan's arm without saying a word. He rested his hand gently on her shoulder for only a moment before she let go on her own. There was no awkwardness, only quiet reassurance. Nathan finally stood once more and picked up his satchel. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with me, he said warmly. I think I received every bit as much as I gave. None of the girls tried to stop him this time. They simply watched with misty eyes as he began walking toward the front entrance. Victoria remained seated, unable to look away. For the first time in many years, success no longer seemed like the greatest achievement in the room. Quiet character did. The brass bell above the entrance rang softly as Nathan reached for the door, but before he could step outside, a small voice behind him gently called his name. Mr. Walker. He turned. Victoria had crossed the room without the confidence that usually accompanied every public appearance. For the first time in years, she looked less like one of the country's most respected chief executive officers and more like a mother searching for the right words. She paused only a few feet away. May I ask you something? Nathan smiled kindly. Of course. She hesitated, surprising even herself. Would you consider having dinner with us sometime? Nathan blinked. Dinner, not as an obligation. Victoria quickly clarified. Not because of today. My daughters. She glanced toward the girls, who were watching with quiet hope. They have not smiled like this in a very long time. Nathan remained silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. That is a generous invitation. Victoria nodded. You may say no. I simply did not want to regret never asking. Nathan looked toward the four sisters. They stood together near the table, patiently waiting without trying to influence his decision. He admired that. Children often understood respect better than adults imagined. He smiled warmly. I appreciate your kindness more than you know. For a brief moment, hope brightened every face in the room. Then Nathan continued gently. But I think I should decline. The smiles faded, though no one spoke. Nathan noticed immediately and continued before disappointment could settle too deeply. Please allow me to explain. Victoria listened carefully. My daughter has spent many years sharing me with work, responsibilities, and everything else life demands. Saturdays belong to her whenever she asks for them. If I begin giving away the little time that belongs to my family, even for wonderful people, I would be teaching the wrong lesson. The tea house became remarkably quiet. Even the nearby conversations seemed to disappear beneath the weight of his simple honesty. Nathan smiled at the girls. The people we love should never have to compete for our attention. Victoria lowered her eyes. Every word felt painfully true without sounding like criticism. He was not judging her. He was simply living by principles she suddenly wished she had never forgotten. The oldest sister slowly stepped forward. So, you really cannot come? Nathan knelt so they were eye level. Not tonight. for little hearts seemed to sink together. Nathan reached into his satchel and removed a small hardcover notebook with a plain blue cover. But perhaps we can make a different promise. The girls looked up hopefully. He carefully tore out one blank page and drew a tiny teacup in the corner with a simple pencil. Beneath it he wrote, "Every first Saturday, at 3 o'clock. Then he folded the page and handed it to the oldest sister. "If life ever brings you here again, and I am free, you will probably find me enjoying tea by that same window." The youngest smiled through watery eyes. "Really?" Nathan nodded. "Good traditions are worth keeping." Victoria watched the exchange in complete silence. He had refused a private dinner with one of the most influential women in America without the slightest interest in status, opportunity, or personal gain. Yet he had freely offered something much more meaningful. Consistency. Trust. A place where 4 little girls would always know they could find kindness. As Nathan finally opened the front door, the cool autumn breeze drifted gently inside, carrying the scent of fallen leaves through the quiet tea house. None of them realized that the simple promise written on one small piece of paper would soon become the beginning of a future none of them had ever dared to imagine. 1 year later, the first Saturday of October arrived with the same golden sunlight spilling through the tall windows of the Whitmore Tea House. The piano still played gentle melodies. The scent of cinnamon and fresh tea still drifted through the room. The corner table by the window remained exactly where it had always been, quietly waiting as though it had been keeping a promise of its own. Nathan Walker looked up from his familiar teacup when the brass bell above the entrance chimed. 4 little girls hurried inside first, no longer quite as little as they had been a year before, their laughter filling the room before their footsteps did. "We made it," the youngest called happily. Nathan stood with the same warm smile he had worn the day they first met. "Right on time," he answered. One after another, the sisters wrapped him in cheerful hugs before stepping aside. Victoria Hayes entered a moment later, dressed simply in a soft blue sweater and jeans instead of the tailored suits that had once defined every public appearance. Her security team remained outside, giving her family something she had learned to value more than privacy alone. They were giving them ordinary moments. Nathan noticed the difference. Immediately. "You look rested," he said kindly. Victoria laughed, a genuine laugh that no boardroom had ever heard. "I started protecting my Saturdays." Nathan nodded with quiet understanding. "That sounds like an excellent investment." She smiled. "It has been the best one I have ever made." They sat together around the same table where everything had begun. The girls eagerly shared stories about school, piano recitals, science projects, and neighborhood adventures. Nathan listened with the same patient attention that had first earned their trust. Every child finished every sentence without interruption. Every accomplishment, no matter how small, received sincere encouragement. Across the table, Victoria simply watched. Months earlier, she had made a decision that changed far more than her schedule. She had declined unnecessary meetings on weekends. She had begun eating breakfast with her daughters every morning she was home. She had learned that bedtime conversations often mattered more than business reports waiting until sunrise. Success had not disappeared. It had simply found its proper place. The oldest sister carefully unfolded the same small piece of paper Nathan had given her a year before. Though the edges had softened with time, the tiny hand-drawn teacup remained clearly visible. "We kept it," she whispered proudly. Nathan smiled. "I was hoping you would." Victoria reached into her handbag and placed a framed drawing on the table. It was the same picture from the year before. The small house still stood beneath the blue sky. 4 smiling girls still stood beside their mother. But now the once empty outline had been gently filled with color. The figure was not standing in front of anyone. It was standing beside everyone. Nathan looked quietly at the drawing before raising his eyes. "Who finished it?" he asked. The girls all pointed toward Victoria. She looked at him with peaceful honesty. They wanted to leave it blank until they understood something. Nathan tilted his head slightly. "And what was that?" Victoria smiled through grateful eyes. "Family is not built by pretending. It is built one kind choice at a time." Silence settled gently around the table, not the silence of uncertainty, but the peaceful kind that follows a truth everyone can feel. Nathan lifted his teacup. Victoria did the same. 4 smaller cups followed. Outside, autumn leaves drifted quietly along the sidewalk just as they had 1 year earlier. Inside, Six grateful hearts shared an ordinary afternoon that had become extraordinary simply because everyone present had chosen kindness over pride, time over status, and love over appearances. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with applause. Sometimes they begin with one quiet table, one shared cup of tea, and one simple decision to make another person feel seen.